Hello, psycholinguistic students. So this is our, excuse me, this is our bilingual language processing lecture, and this is the lecture for April 8th, which is Monday. Now, this will be the last lecture. Then for Wednesday, you guys will be in class where you will have Review Jeopardy, and then on Friday, you will have the third exam, and then the following Monday, week from today, you will see me. Well, we won't have class, but I will be on campus. All right, so let's begin. Let's talk about some of the basics of what being bilingual is. So when we're talking about bilingualism, usually that is shorthand. There's a couple ways that that's used for shorthand. Researchers refer to your native language as L1 and your second language, the language that you acquired after your native language, as L2. That's something that we'll come back to quite a bit throughout this lecture, L1 and L2. So, what does it mean to be bilingual? The answer to this question has changed a bit throughout the years. There might be some people out there who think that someone is bilingual if they're equally proficient in two languages. Someone might be bilingual if they have a minimal competence in a second language. But most scientists, most language scientists agree that someone is bilingual if they have a functional command of two languages. So what does that mean to have a functional command? Well, it means that you can function in that language. You can go through your daily tasks, you can run your errands, you can go to a doctor, you can go to the grocery store, you can make your needs known. You can basically function in a society that uses that language. So you don't have to know the language perfectly, but you have to be able to get through a normal day using that language. All right, so there are several different types of bilingualism, and the first that we're going to talk about is coordinate bilingualism. So coordinate bilingualism occurs when you have separate language-specific meanings associated with your native and your second language. So you have two sets of meaning and two different linguistic systems. This is typically the case when you have people who function in two very different environments where two different languages are used. Compound bilingualism occurs when you have one semantic universe, one meaning system for both languages, L1 and L2. We call this fused representations. So you have one meaning system, but you have two different ways to express that meaning system. So you have one semantic universe, one semantic network, but you have two different language systems you can use to talk about that semantic network. So the difference between compound and coordinate bilingualism will probably make a little bit more sense when we start to talk about some specific examples in the upcoming slides. Stay tuned. And then the last form of bilingualism that language scientists talk about is what's called subordinate bilingualism. And this occurs when you're weak in a language. When the second language that you're learning, you're new to it, you don't know it that well. So you have some struggles. So when this is the case in subordinate bilingualism, you interpret the um, you interpret the second language through your native language. So the native language being the language that you have more proficiency in, you translate everything into your native language before you can understand the meaning behind it. And this is typically the case for people who are just learning a language. Every time they have to translate into their native language to make sure it makes sense. Okay, so there are a couple different ways that bilingualism can occur, meaning there's a couple different ways that people can learn two different languages. Depending on how these two different languages are acquired, that can lead to either coordinate bilingualism or compound bilingualism. So, usually a coordinate bilingualism situation occurs when the two languages are used in different settings in childhood. So imagine an immigrant child comes to a new country with their family, and in the home with mom and dad, one language is spoken, but then at school, a completely separate language is spoken. So this would be a situation where you've got two different semantic networks essentially, because you've got one language that deals with language of the home. So maybe you talk about, pass the potatoes, you talk about what you did in school that day, you talk about what your friends are up to, you talk about getting to soccer practice. And then in a completely different social environment, you talk about math problems and how to do division and how to do multiplication. You talk about how to get to your lunch period on time. So you have two completely different semantic universes or semantic networks, and you have two completely different language systems to talk about those two different semantic networks. So this would be an example of coordinate bilingualism. Compound bilingualism would occur if both languages are used and the person learning them is exposed to them in the same environment. So this would be the case if a child was raised in a home where two languages were spoken within that home. So this time you've got one semantic network or one set of meaning, and you've got exposure to two different ways, two different languages to talk about that set of semantic meaning. So, um, simultaneous bilingualism and sequential bilingualism, these are also different ways that children can acquire two different languages. Simultaneous bilingualism, this occurs when both languages are presented to the child or the language learner at the same time. So this is typically the case when someone grows up in a bilingual home or even a bilingual community. So if two different languages, let's say English and Spanish, are both spoken within the home of this child, then they'll be learning those two languages at the same time. And ideally, if they're exposed to equal amounts, then they will have roughly the same proficiency in both languages. Sequential bilingualism, this occurs later on in life. So a native language has been established, they're very proficient in it, they can communicate with whoever they need to very well in that language, and then either through direct effort or through just sort of happenstance exposure, they acquire a second language. So one language is learned first, and then another language is learned after that. We call this sequential bilingualism. Okay, moving on. All right, so that's a little bit about the basics or the fundamentals of bilingualism and what language scientists talk about. But being the good psycholinguistic researchers that we are interested in how bilingual processing occurs. How do we talk about, or how does the mind process these two completely different language systems? So the first is what we call the switch hypothesis. And if you remember back to when we were talking about the lexicon, I presented you guys with the idea of a straw man argument, and that's what the switch hypothesis is. It's a straw man argument. It's something that we can beat up, it's something that we can poke holes in and provide an alternative that makes a lot more sense. So let's talk about the switch hypothesis. So in the switch hypothesis, there's a language switch, some sort of theoretical switch somewhere in the mind, and this allows us to switch between languages that we're proficient in. So the switch might be activated based on who we're talking to. It might be activated based on the social situation we're in. But regardless of how this switch flips, it turns our language system from one language to the other. So it turns one language on and turns the other language off, meaning we can't access it. It's not involved in processing at all. Now, like I said, this is a straw man argument. There's a substantial amount of evidence against the switch hypothesis. So, for example, um, if you have a word that exists in two languages but means two different things, and you have a speaker, a language user who is proficient in both of those languages, a bilingual speaker, they will show activation for both of those meanings. So, for example, the word full in English means full. It means maybe you ate a lot, you're not hungry anymore, or a bucket could be full. So something is up to the brim, it's at capacity. In the Swedish language, being full means you're drunk. You are full, you are drunk. You're awful full, you're awful drunk. So if you gave a Swedish English bilingual speaker the word full, both of those two different meanings would be activated in their mind. And we can measure this using priming studies. So if the switch hypothesis were true, we would not see this simultaneous activation of both the English meaning for full and the Swedish meaning for full. So that's one big strike against the switch hypothesis right there. We've also got evidence from orthographic words. So orthographic neighbors in two different languages can be active during word recognition. So an example of this, let's say you're given the word tree. It's an English word, but you also happen to be a speaker of the Dutch language. A very similarly spelled word is train, T-R-E-I-N. A lot of similar letters mean something different. It actually means a train, just like the word train in English. Spelled slightly differently though. So if you give someone the word tree, this actually slightly activates the word train in Dutch. So here we have two pieces of evidence showing that two language systems can be active at the same time. And that goes directly against what the switch hypothesis would say, which is that we can only have one language active at a time. All right, so let's talk about a substitute, something that we can put in the place of the switch hypothesis, and hopefully it stands up to scrutiny a little bit better. Sorry, I keep adjusting the microphone. These headphones are falling off my head. My brain's too big, I guess. I don't know. It comes with all this learning I've been doing my whole life. Anyway, so let's talk about some other ways that bilingual language processing might occur. Okay, so language tagging. This is an idea that's been offered up as a replacement for the switch hypothesis. So language tagging is this idea that every single word that we have stored in our lexicon has a bunch of meta information attached to it. So these tags hold information about the semantic meaning of the word. So you're given the word apple, and it has a semantic meaning. It's those juicy pieces of fruit that grow on trees and we harvest in large quantities every fall. It also has a grammatical tag. There's grammatical information attached to this word apple. We know as proficient English language users that apple is a noun. It's not a verb. Someone cannot physically apple. They can't engage in the verb apple. So it is a noun, it's not a verb. And it also has a language tab. So if you come across the word apple, the language that that word is from is also attached to that word. So you've got all of these word forms in your lexicon, like apple, and attached to all of these word forms, you have a bunch of different pieces of information. Semantic information, grammatical information, language information. So that language is just no different from the semantic or grammatical information that you are probably used to thinking is attached to words. All right, so that's setting up our next hypothesis here, which we call activation and control. And this is sort of where the field is at right now. Admittedly, this is a new branch of psycholinguistic research. It's not something that we have studied very extensively. Hopefully, at this point in the class, you've sort of gotten the idea that psycholinguistics and language science in general is a relatively new field. It's only been around for a couple decades. There's still a lot to learn, and we're still trying to figure out in what direction we even want to take this field. But back to activation and control. So, in this idea, each language system that a bilingual speaker has will be at a different level of activation. And these levels of activation can take three forms: selected, active, or dormant. So bilinguals don't necessarily have conscious control over the activation level of a language system. It's something that gets suppressed automatically or gets activated automatically. And that's based on a couple different pieces of input. It's based on how many words we're coming in contact with that have a specific language tag. So if you're that English, Swedish bilingual speaker and you're coming across a lot of words that have a Swedish language tag attached to them, you're probably going to start to suppress your English language system and start to use your Swedish language system. But, so here are the specifics of the three levels of activation. So if the language is selected, it's currently being spoken. It's the language that you're actively engaged in dialogue or narrative with. If a language is active, it means that it plays a role in ongoing processing. So it is something that you are comprehending. Let's say you are the listener in a conversation. Your language system that is being used in that particular conversation, it'll be active. It'll help you understand what the speaker is saying. And then last, a language system is dormant if it is not playing a role in either speaking or comprehension. So it's back there in memory. It's not playing an explicit role in ongoing processing, but it is there in case we need it. Okay, so that is a little bit about the very basics of bilingual language processing. And now I want to switch gears, shift gears. Couldn't decide between those two words, so I decided to combine them. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about bilingual language in general. So in certain circles in the United States, this is a very contentious issue. Meaning, should bilingualism even be something that we encourage in the United States today? The United States is somewhat of a unique example. The vast majority of people on this planet speak more than one language. People who grew up in the United States today, there's a very good chance that they will grow up speaking only one language, that being English. I am one of those people. I only know the English language. I know very small amounts of Spanish and German, but I would in no way consider myself proficient in either of those languages. Now, there is definitely a bit of a controversy surrounding this issue. Should we teach children other languages in school? So I've got a video for you guys, and that is linked on this slide here. And I am going to encourage you to watch this. It is a PBS NewsHour special. It's about a 10-minute long video, not too long. And I want you to think about where you fall on this issue. Do you think teaching another language in elementary schools is something that we should encourage in the US today? Or do you think it's something that we should not? Just don't put effort towards it, don't put resources towards it. So, if you watch this video and you write up a one-page reflection paper, reflection/reaction paper, I'd be willing to give you extra credit based on the quality of that paper. So when you're writing this paper, obviously state your case if you think that this is something that should be encouraged in the US today or not encouraged. But then I also want you to address the issue of how success in schools is actually measured. And I will leave it at that.
Okay, that is all I have for bilingual language processing. Again, um, this lecture is for Monday, April 8th, and then Wednesday, April 10th, you have a review day where you're going to play Jeopardy! Amy Kneppel-Carney should be the ringleader for that. And then on Friday, April 12th, you have your third and final exam for this course. All right, have a good one, guys.